Can I just say that we've had quite a lot of online chat, so thanks everyone for participating. I've got a question for Tom from Laura. Have you explored the different kinds of partnerships? For example, are there strategic partnerships out there, or are the partnerships mostly on a tactical level?
Okay.
That was for Tom.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, sure.
Sorry.
Just considering my response. I think it depends really how you define tactical and strategical. But I think, for instance, I think housing associations have a really fundamental role to play in helping communities to develop assets and to own assets as well. I think they're probably the sort of most easily identifiable partner, as they have sort of quite a distinct role to perhaps an independent community organisation, but also complementary in many respects, because Caroline touched to in the introduction to her organisation, they can play a wider role in their community as anchors. I think, and I think they can be sort of tactical as well, though, in the sense of perhaps untapping different mechanisms of funding as well. It's a bit difficult to answer the question in more specifically due to sort of diversity of the community asset sector, because it will obviously depend on the type of assets that the community organisation's seeking to develop. But I would say that predominantly, to answer the question, I'd say partnerships tend to be more sort of tactical in terms of meeting specific needs of community organisations.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question from Sandy for either Tom or Peter. Are there key actions that can accelerate the cultural change processes often hold back change?
What was the second part of it?
Are there key actions that can accelerate the cultural change processes that can often hold back the change?
Go first? Or?
I think. Do you mind going first?
No, yeah, sure, yeah, sure, yeah. I'll just again consider my response. I think one of the it's not a key action as such, but I would say, as I hope I was trying to really allude to in my presentation, I think in trying to legislate for any sort of community asset development or create any new policies to encourage it, I think there really needs to be a consideration of the institutional framework in which it operates. I don't think it's about just legislating for the decentralisation of power or resources to communities. It's about considering the processes by which they access those resources or what they may do with that power. So in terms of, it's not a key action as such, but again, referring to my own research, which was on community land trusts in England, what we found was really the key action really wasn't legislating for them in terms of they were inserted into a housing regeneration bill which defined what a community land trust is and what its constitution may look like, but rather the thing that accelerated cultural change within local governments and national governments and key partners was the existence of these intermediary organisations that sort of bridged the community and the community perspectives with those of the wider sort of strategic partners that play a key role in unlocking resources and empowering communities. So it's not a key action as such, but as I'd just say, that's really the cultural change can come from a bridging role as one example.
Okay, thank you.
I think just to add on that, because I've now had time to think about what my answer might be, I'd just like to sort of tell a bit of a story about how the collaboration with Prospect emerged in many respects for me. Professor Chris Speed at the University of Edinburgh sort of got involved with Whale Arts and Prospect in the sort of the totem pole side of the project. And he just sort of mentioned, I followed him on Twitter, and he just mentioned in a tweet that I've been out to West Hales, and I tweeted back, my PhD is in West Hales, what are you doing? Found out what he was doing, and eventually we met for lunch, and as good middle class academics, I had an overpriced lunch at the posh Peter's Yard Swedish place, and basically he talking about his project, and he said quite honestly to me, I need the sort of reflexivity you've got to hold me back. I need you to stop me being the middle class do-gooder, coming in, going to this deprived neighbourhood and doing what I think is good for that neighbourhood. I need the resources I had as somebody who's done a lot of research in this area. And so this sort of partnership with Chris developed from that. And I think to answer that question, I think there is a role for to go back to my first presentation as well, there's a role for cultural capital and the ability of people like myself to deploy cultural capital to help break through innovation, help get these processes moving. But it has to be tempered by a reflexivity. It can't be do-gooding, it has to be enabling. And I think it's very difficult, and I think as academics, we've found that quite difficult, and it's a line we've had to tread very carefully. And I think generally it's something that has to be dealt with very carefully.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got another question from Greenerleaf. What happens when a community takes over a public asset and then something goes wrong, which means the asset becomes derelict or lost to the community?
Sure. Well, what happens fundamentally, if it's in the community's ownership, it's their responsibility. I'm not precisely sure what the current proposals for asset transfer detail on what happens to an asset if the community organisation goes out of business or bankrupt. But I suppose that's really reiterating the point I was making in my presentation, is that ultimately assets still have to be managed in sort of a financially viable and responsible manner. There's nothing to say community organisations can't do it, but there's also nothing that says they do that better than the public sector already does. And that's something that really needs to be considered when asset transfer policies will be designed and implemented.
Okay, thank you. Ronald and Carl would both like to see more details on the web analytics you did on your Facebook account, Peter. And Carl was also wondering if the copies of the slides would be available afterwards so that they can have a look at them.
Yep, I'm happy for my slides to be made available. I'm sure they're
absolutely.
Yeah. So, and if you follow me on Twitter, I'm at Urbane Professor. I'll try and remember to tweet the links so you can get them out even quicker, and they'll be put on the interface website. On the web analytics, it's only available, I think, if you have a specific Facebook page, and you have to have over 1,000 likes, and you have to have a certain level of activity. I think you need to have 30 bits of activity around your page in a week to get the data for that week. And basically, if you log in, and I think it's along the top of the Facebook page, it's just called Insights, and you can log into that, and basically you can ask Facebook to generate a lot of reports that will give you data on the users of that Facebook page based on their profiles. And the other good thing I found is that you can then use Facebook will prompt you to ask it, do you want to promote your page, your advertising? And you can go into that and say, oh, yes, I do. And you can go through it and you can tick all the different demographics and sort of say, and what I was doing was isolating Edinburgh, so all users of Facebook who have said they're in Edinburgh. And then I'd choose the age group. And I'd find out how many people of that age group are Facebook members in Edinburgh. And I could compare that to broader statistical data on Edinburgh and find out how many people were using Facebook in Edinburgh, and then compare the engagement with our site to that. So it's just a really, really fantastic resource. One thing to be wary of, though, is because Facebook is essentially a marketing company, when those categories, like the age categories, they're quite fuzzy, but there's a little tiny, tiny tick box hidden away that says exact figures only. And if you tick that, then suddenly your populations shrink, because say on a 25 to 34-year-old for Facebook, isn't necessarily people of that age, it's people of that age and people who share similar characteristics in their Facebook use to people of that age. So the broad category will be much broader. So you have to make sure you're ticking the right boxes, and you can get really fantastic data on users and the demographics of the users from Facebook. You even find out how many are interested in hobbies and things like that, but we weren't interested in that.
Okay, thank you. One final question from Sandy. Do speakers envisage academic institutions creating more social enterprise spin-outs from collaborations?
Who wants to start?
I think for me, it's been a sort of interesting process in sort of coming to this webinar as that, because there are a few examples of that. There's a company, I think called Ketso, or Kitso, and they are a spin out from University of Manchester, and that's a community participation toolkit that they developed, and that's a classic case of somebody doing research like me and developing a social enterprise around that. But I think and there is especially I'm based here at Heriot-Watt, we're an engineering university, very much about your IP and getting your patent and getting your spin-out company in the research park and making your millions and driving your Ferrari. And as you probably gathered, that's not really what I'm about. And I don't think I'll ever be about that. But that's not to say that partnerships and social enterprises can't emerge out of universities. And I think there are examples of that. I just think you have to find the academic who wants to do that. I'm afraid in this case it's not going to be me. But
Sure. In terms of social enterprise spin-outs, I mean, that doesn't really address exactly what I spoke about, but what I would say is I think it's that academics have a role in this community assets agenda in perhaps supporting communities. Perhaps making sure their research is not only, as Peter alluded to, academics can be quite selfish and we have our own sort of objectives for doing research, but equally I think it's important when working with communities that the research is actually useful for people on the ground who are involved in these sort of challenges day to day. So I would just really endorse sort of the town and gown collaborations, as it were, and really say that academics need to take that into account when conducting research.
Do we have any questions from the audience here?
I've got a general question. It's in terms of community empowerment. How do you see the work of the Community Empowerment Bill relating and developing to the work of the Land Reform Review Group that's ongoing at the minute?
I saw your name badge, so I know you're from the Scottish Government, so you might be able to tell us something about that. I think from my perspective, I think it sort of has to be essential because from what I understand of the Land Reform Group, and I'm not an expertise in land reform or landlord anyway, but from what I understand of what they're looking at questions like, well, what constitutes an urban community? And you need to have answers for questions like that to instigate a community right to buy in urban areas. So I think they do have to be very closely aligned, and pretty much the Land Reform Group needs to be looking to deliver a big chunk of that community empowerment agenda that was set out in the consultation.
Sure. I think I'd just really endorse what Peter said. And also say that my presentation and the comments I made on the land reform were primarily related to Part 2 of the Act, which is the preemptive community right to buy. And there's other parts to that as well, that related to sort of crofting communities. And they sort of gave different rights to communities. And I'm not sure if community was defined in a different way, but it's quite clear that the urban right to buy is probably going to have to be constituted quite differently from the way the rural one was in both parts. And it just really, I think, it's essential that the sort of two pieces of work really collaborate across.
Do you have any particular suggestions for how the urban community right to buy should work? Because you suggest it should be quite different.
Sure. Well, I don't have concrete suggestions myself, but when I say it should be quite different, I think the definition of community is really the most striking one. The current rural community right to buy, as I alluded to, I think community is defined in relation to population and spatially. Urban communities often sort of straddle boundaries, they're not so clearly defined. So I really think that that has to be quite an extended and it has to be a very intensive process and intensive is not really the word I'm looking for, in-depth process in terms of speaking to initial to sort of local community bodies, community anchors and representatives in terms of how communities should be constituted. Because ultimately, if a community is to instigate a right to buy, it's probably them who will be defining what their community is. But that's got to be balanced, obviously, with a more strategic perspective.
I think my concern around it would be the social justice aspects of it and making sure that very strong social justice message from the community empowerment consultation is brought through, because what it seems to be the picture that seems to be emerging in England, where sort of because of the localism they're a bit further ahead on this, is that if you're in an affluent community, if you just shout and moan lots, then your library won't be closed down. If you're in a deprived community, well, why don't you exercise the right to buy and run your own library? And it's like, no, that shouldn't. It should be the other way around. Actually, affluent communities they've got the resources to run their own services, and in terms of just in their abilities, let alone the money. So it's making sure that social justice is developed through those proposals.
I would also just add as well, it would be interesting to look at the way the current proposals in England in relation to community right to buy assets are progressing. They're still in their very early stages, but that exists in urban areas. So it'd be interesting to see how those proposals progress.
I've just realised why I need to use this. Can I just say that, and I've just asked Peter this on Twitter, how did the people in Wester Hales view all of this? Because it's their social capital that we're talking about, not ours. Wester Hales, as colleagues probably know, is probably one of the most researched and professionally researched communities in the whole of Scotland. You've only got to read Lawrence's piece in the Scott Bulletin every week to see what Lawrence thinks about it. So it's been very, very well researched, and a lot of money from Scottish Government and other organisations has gone into Wester Hales. But I have to say, if you go around the place, okay, there have been some changes, but not that much. Since we're talking about a pretty innovative use of Facebook, and I must admit, Peter, that I hadn't realised that you can do that kind of analysis on Facebook. It's in many ways better than SurveyMonkey. Since you can do that kind of analysis on Facebook, and since this was really in-your-face social media, I mean, you're sticking things on totem poles and you really are putting in people's faces in terms that they can understand. I'm just wondering what their reaction has been to all of this. I very much value, by the way, the role of a housing association in doing this. I mean, in my book, that's what housing associations ought to have been doing for a long time. But this is really, if you like, putting social capital or potential social capital into a community on their terms. So I'm just wondering what they thought about it.
I think it's quite early days to know. As Peter said, the totem pole's not been up for that long. The fact that it's still there is an indicator to us that people like it being there. The Facebook page is extremely well used.
Still.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah, it's growing. Peter's slide's out of date. We've got nearly 2,000 users on the Facebook page. I think the challenge for us in using Facebook is we have different interests, I guess, to the university. Well, Peter's been doing a lot of analytics on it. We are interested in seeing whether we can take it a stage further and get people to interact face-to-face as well as online. So we've been promoting local events and local issues on the page alongside the history to see what comes from that. I suppose an early success project from our point of view was that we wrote quite a bit about the old fun run that used to happen in Wester Hales, and that ceased because there weren't the volunteers to run it. When we publicised the history of that event, there was so much kind of positive memories and feedback about it, we thought, well, why don't we try it again? Now, that's just one small thing. You might say, well, what's a fun run going to do? It's not going to change an area. But it's all about bringing people together, and people that haven't come forward before. It's trying to find new people to be involved. I think Wester Hales is at a point in its history when some of the people that have been involved as activists for a long time are getting on in life, and that's not how they want to spend their entire lives, is fighting for the area. So it's saying, well, is another generation coming up that we can work with? And I suppose that's the challenge from our point of view, and whether we can come back in a couple of years' time and say, and all these other things also came out of this process. So it's a bit of an unknown, and that, from our point of view, that's what I'm interested in. Can we actually translate people coming onto the Facebook page once a week into actually more concrete action?
Any more questions?
Thank you. Edward was commenting, he said there's a need to develop robust options for community organisations contemplating early feasibility or scoping work. How can we work towards that? Existing advisors often have compromised interests.
The housing association will do that.
Sure. It's difficult to comment on advisors having compromised interests. I'm not exactly sure what we're referring to there. A member of the audience just said housing associations could do something like that, and I think, not to steal your thunder, but I think that's a very good response, in the sense that housing associations are quite rooted in local communities, particularly community-controlled housing associations, and if they can be a resource for sort of community organisations, and that's the type of partnerships I was referring to, I think they could help assist with sort of feasibility and scoping.
I think it sort of goes back to the need for capacity building within public sector organisations. If community organisations be looking to buy assets of local authorities need to have the capacity within them to respond constructively to those approaches, and also have sort of Chinese walls within them, so you might have a community development bit, the local authority who can engage constructively with that community organisation, help them and support them into getting that proposal, moving that proposal forward to a sort of realistic position.
Sure.
My name's Justine. I work for Edinburgh Tenants Federation, and my role as an outreach worker is to go out and work with local tenants and residents organisations. And I often think that that is they are an organisation that is overlooked, and I think that just by doing a little bit more research into an area, if they can get that connection with the residents group, then I mean you open up so many more doors. It's really great.
No, I'd echo that. In my own research as well, found that tenants and residents organisations are fantastic, often contain really great activists who are really empowered and very committed to their neighbourhood, and yeah, they are overlooked. They're not seen. They're kind of, because they're not up at the community council level, they're not in statute, then they're kind of overlooked and they're missed out. And basically, it's just the local authority housing department or the housing association that will turn to them, and other bits of the public sector won't turn to tenants and residents associations.
Which I've actually found this quite interesting today, because I've been working with a group in Calders who are wanting to take over their local community centre that has fallen into a state of disrepair, and there's been a little bit of an uncertainty about the ownership of the building and the land, because as far as they're aware, that council own the land, but the building's actually owned by the community. So there's a lot of interesting things going on in that community at the moment, and they're just pulling together a business case. So but I found it really useful coming along today and hearing all the presentations, because I've been able to jot down a few things that they can be doing and looking into. So it's been really great today. So thanks.
So, yeah, you'll be pleased to know that even us as academics, we face similar challenges with getting the totem pole up, because when we put in a planning application for the totem pole, there's a little box on the application form where you say, have you let the landowner know you apply for planning permission? And we tick that because we presume we apply for planning permission to the council, and solely the council own the land. So the council would let themselves know that we're putting this totem pole. And then I think it was 2 days before the totem pole was due to go in the ground, we got an email, panicked email saying, they're going to stop us. They haven't told the council, haven't told themselves the totem pole has to go in the ground. So we were, oh great, we've got this far. And luckily it was literally just an email had to be sent to another manager saying, oh yeah, that's fine. What is that? One department, the planning department, was dealing with the planning application, and another department owned the land.
Okay, I think we'll just take one final few questions from the online audience.
Thanks, Jill. I just have one final question for all the speakers. What are your ideas on how you can turn engagement into empowerment?
That's a big one.
That's the
2 minutes,
challenge, really. I think
Yeah.
it's we feel we're at the engagement stage, and we're hoping that in a few years' time that will reap results. But it is an unknown situation from that point of view. It's early days. But I think the more ways you can engage, I think what the Facebook experience has shown us is that finding ways to hook people in is sometimes the first stage. So people seeing themselves at a carnival 20 years ago might not seem like a very promising way to get people involved in community empowerment, but actually that's what brings people into the network, and they share that information with other people. And that's what the value of the online projects have been, I think, is that it spreads very fast and very quickly, and a lot of people can't get involved. So.
But just one final thing, if I may. I don't think you should overlook the unique advantages that you've got in the project that we've had presented this afternoon. I mean, first of all, if I may say so, not all housing associations would get into the kind of stuff that you're doing. Not all housing associations would think that they had to or needed to. I mean, I very much support what you've been doing. And if I may say so, not all academics have got the social media capability that Peter's got. It's a rather unique combination. I mean, I'm a PhD student as well. But I mean, I wouldn't have thought of using Facebook in the analytical way that you have. And the most important thing is that in all of the stuff that you're doing, you're presenting the details of the project and you're presenting as you go along to people at their level. Wester Hales has had project after project after project, which the Scottish Government could well understand, which maybe even Heriot Watt could understand, but I'm not so sure the people living on Wester Hales could understand.
I think, and for me, that's the big difference between engagement and empowerment. Empowerment is on people's own terms, and there's a community activist from West Hales in the 1990s was involved in the project that the Scottish Executive back in the day set up in the early 1990s called the Scottish Social Inclusion Network. And one of their reports ends with a quote, and I can hear this community activist speaking in it. It's something along the lines of, people in deprived neighbourhoods shouldn't have to turn up to endless meetings to get the level of services that people in affluent neighbourhoods expect to get. And for me, that's the core of it. Community empowerment isn't about dragging deprived neighbourhoods to meetings. It's about and saying, oh yes, if you come to this meeting, we'll give you a better bin service. It's about actually delivering that bin service because they deserve to have better environmental services. And then empowering them on their own terms. I'm empowered as a middle-class service user because when my recycling bin doesn't get emptied, I've got the social and cultural capital to email the council and keep emailing them for months when it's not emptied. And I'm empowered to do that. But actually, some people are empowered just to tell a story about a crow on Facebook. And that's their empowerment, and that should be respected, and that should be used.
Totally agree.
Comment on that?
Well, yeah, I think in terms of how do you turn engagement into empowerment, I think I'd really reiterate Peter's line about it has to be on the terms of communities. I think asset acquisition, management and ownership, it's a lengthy, time-consuming process, not just at the acquisition stage, but over a long period of time. And really, engagement for asset-based approaches to empowerment really are not solely reliant, but heavily reliant on extensive engagement. So communities are able to identify the how, the what, the who is involved in these projects in order to be able to take them forward over the long term. And I think asset-based approaches have a real sort of great potential for empowerment of communities, but there's also the risk of sort of exacerbating inequalities within and between communities as well, unless the engagement is done in the sort of the thorough and correct manner that it needs.
Okay, well, on that note, I think it's 4 o'clock, so unfortunately we need to bring the conversation to an end. But I'd like to thank Tom, Peter and Caroline for being such engaged and interesting speakers this afternoon. I'd like to thank our audience both here and online for participating, and I assure you we will make all slides and contact details available to everyone in due course. Thank you very much.